The city below Nathaniel Carter's penthouse glittered with 1,000 points of light, each one a reminder of lives unfolding in warmth and companionship. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, glass of Cabernet in hand, the ruby liquid catching the glow of Boston's skyline. To anyone else, it would have looked like perfection. The sleek, minimalist apartment with its leather furniture, the polished oak floors, the art pieces chosen at auction. To Nathaniel, it was a museum he lived in rather than a home. Every object carried a price tag, but no memory, no imprint of laughter or love. At 42, he was the kind of man others admired in passing. His suits were tailored in charcoal and navy, his watch gleamed with quiet authority, his name carried weight in financial circles. He could walk into any boardroom and tilt the balance with a single recommendation. Yet, when the meetings ended and the applause of clients faded, silence was his only companion. He moved through his life like an efficient machine, routines sharp and unyielding, as if by controlling the hours he could control the ache buried beneath them. Every morning before dawn he laced up his running shoes and took the same path along the Charles River, the cold air biting at his skin, the rhythmic slap of his feet on the pavement the only sound. Rowers sometimes cut across the mist, laughter carrying from their boats, but Nathaniel never slowed. He ran as though chased by something invisible, something that had lived with him for 10 years. When he returned, sweat dripping down his back, the apartment felt emptier still. The fridge was stocked with neat rows of bottled water and imported cheeses he barely touched. The cleaning service kept everything immaculate, but even the gleaming counters whispered of absence. On nights like this, with the city alive outside his glass walls, he remembered the axiom. Dent. He never spoke about it. Daniel, his oldest friend, had stopped asking long ago, but Amelia's absence pressed in around him like a second skin. His sister had been younger, reckless in the way youth sometimes is, and he had been too busy then, too caught in the endless ladder of promotions and clients to answer her call that night. By morning, she was gone, her car wrapped around an oak tree on a Virginia street. Official reports told him the facts: impact, injuries, time of death. What they never told him was what haunted him most, whether she had been alone in those last minutes, whether she had been afraid. He had built his empire in the years since, consulting contracts that brought him wealth, connections that opened doors, accolades that filled his office shelves. Yet none of it reached the hollow place inside him. Friends drifted away, tired of unanswered invitations. Women came and went, their laughter echoing against the cold glass of his penthouse before fading into memory. Work became the only constant, a fortress he could retreat into when grief threatened to break through. Tonight was no different. The wine was rich, the view exquisite, the silence unbearable. Nathaniel placed the glass on the counter and rubbed the permanent crease between his brows, a line carved there not by age but by a decade of solitude. Somewhere in the city, fireworks were being tested for the New Year's Eve celebrations. The faint boom echoed across the river, a reminder that another year was ending, another year spent in the company of ghosts. He turned away from the window, telling himself he preferred it this way, that control and routine were safer than chance. Yet a small voice, the same one he silenced every night, whispered that life could not be lived in museums and empty apartments forever. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, but the silence followed him down the hall, settling into the corners of his immaculate bedroom. 10 years had passed since Amelia's accident, but time had done nothing to dull the ache. It had only hardened it into ritual, into loneliness disguised as discipline. He slid beneath the crisp sheets, staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep would come only in fragments. In the stillness, her name surfaced again, unbidden, as it did every night. And with it came the thought that perhaps the life he'd built was less a triumph and more a cage he'd locked around himself, too afraid to open the door. Nathaniel woke the next morning with the stale taste of wine on his tongue and the heaviness of another empty night pressing against his chest. The city was already moving beyond the glass walls of his apartment, traffic buzzing, people rushing toward offices, and lives that seemed fuller than his own. He buttoned his shirt with mechanical precision, the charcoal suit hanging perfectly from his shoulders, the tie knotted so tightly it felt like armor. He told himself he had no time for distractions. That was the lie he had perfected for a decade. By noon, his phone buzzed with Daniel's name flashing across the screen. Nathaniel almost ignored it. He knew the conversation they would have because Daniel never let things go. He answered anyway, his voice even but guarded. Daniel was already laughing on the other end, already throwing words like a man who knew how to wedge himself into Nathaniel's carefully locked doors. "You're not backing out tonight," Daniel said. "I made the reservation myself. Velour, corner table with the river view. New Year's Eve, Nate. If you keep hiding, you'll waste another decade." Nathaniel leaned back in his office chair, staring at the neat columns of numbers on his computer screen. He wanted to argue, wanted to say business was too pressing, but the truth was no deal was urgent tonight. What Daniel was offering wasn't business, it was risk. He swallowed, hearing the smirk in his friend's voice. "She's brilliant," Daniel pressed. "Sharp, funny, and exactly what you need. Her name is Eleanor Ha." "Yes. You'll thank me for this one." Suspicion gnawed at him. Blind dates were for people still searching, not for men who had already buried their chances. "What makes you so certain she'll want to meet me?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "Because she's lost someone too," Daniel replied, his tone softening. "And sometimes two broken pieces can fit together better than a whole one." The words lodged inside Nathaniel like a stone. He hated how much they rattled him. He hated even more the truth in them. Hours later, he found himself in the polished elevator of velour, the kind of place where chandeliers hung like constellations and every tablecloth was pressed to perfection. His reflection stared back at him from the gleaming metal doors, older than the boy who had once dreamed of writing novels, harder than the brother who had once teased Amelia about her terrible singing voice. He adjusted his tie for the 10th time, feeling the weight of his pulse in his throat. The elevator chimed and the doors parted to reveal warm light and murmured conversations. A maitre d' led him to the table by the window, where the Charles River stretched like a ribbon of black glass beneath the city's skyline. He ordered bourbon neat, the burn of it his only companion. He told himself he could still leave, that he could settle the bill and vanish before anyone noticed. Then the restaurant's entrance stirred and his breath caught. She stepped inside with a confidence that pulled every pair of eyes in her direction. The emerald green of her dress seemed to glow beneath the crystal lights. Her natural curls swept elegantly away from her face, her smile disarming in its warmth. Eleanor Hayes. She was nothing like the shadow he had imagined, nothing like the women who had passed briefly through his life. For one stunned moment, Nathaniel felt the years collapse, felt the silence of his penthouse. Sick-crack. And when her eyes found his across the crowded room, when recognition flickered there as though she had been waiting just as long as he had, Nathaniel understood something he had not dared admit. He had walked into this evening expecting to survive a dinner. Instead, he had stepped into the beginning of a story that was already reaching for him like a hand in the dark. Eleanor's smile widened as she crossed the floor, and the sound of her heels against the marble seemed louder than the hum of conversations around them. Nathaniel stood so abruptly he nearly knocked over his glass. He extended a hand, but she surprised him by leaning in, her perfume brushing past him like lavender carried on summer air. "You must be Nathaniel," she said, her voice rich, warm, and edged with quiet amusement. "And you must be Eleanor," he replied, his throat suddenly dry. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. They settled at the table, the city glittering behind her through the glass. Nathaniel realized he was staring, not at the skyline, but at the way she seemed so alive, every gesture measured yet effortless. She asked if he had been waiting long, and he lied politely, claiming he had just arrived, though the half-empty bourbon betrayed him. Eleanor caught it, but instead of pressing, she let the silence hang, testing him. Dinner orders were placed quickly, but the conversation unfolded slowly, a dance of guarded truths and teasing half-smiles. She asked about his work, and he deflected, offering neat answers, the kind he gave clients. Yet Eleanor's eyes were sharp. She leaned forward, chin resting on her hand, studying him like a puzzle she intended to solve. "You don't like talking about yourself," she observed. "I prefer listening," he countered, though he knew it sounded rehearsed. "Listening is good," she admitted, "but hiding is something else." The words cut deeper than he expected. For a decade he had perfected the art of retreat, but here was a stranger unraveling him with a single sentence. He tried to steer the conversation back to her, and she allowed it, though not without that flicker of knowing in her gaze. Eleanor spoke of her career in law, of long nights proving herself in rooms where she was underestimated. She spoke of battles fought not only for clients but for her right to stand where she did. There was strength in her voice, but beneath it, Nathaniel sensed something else, a history she hadn't revealed yet. He wanted to ask, but instinct told him to wait. Their meals arrived, steam curling upward, scents rich and tempting. Yet Nathaniel hardly tasted his food. He found himself captivated by the cadence of her voice, the way she punctuated her stories with laughter that didn't quite mask the fatigue beneath. He felt the distance between them shrinking with every passing minute. Outside, fireworks cracked against the sky earlier than expected, practice runs for the coming midnight. Light flared across Eleanor's face, casting her in sudden gold. Nathaniel stared, struck by how beautiful she looked in that moment, how fragile and strong all at once. Then her tone shifted, subtle but deliberate. "Daniel said you lost someone," she said quietly. The words hit him like a glass shattering. He set down his fork, suddenly aware of the hollow ache that had followed him into this room. He hadn't intended to speak of Amelia, not tonight, maybe not ever. Yet Eleanor's eyes held no judgment, only the kind of empathy that made hiding impossible. "Yes," he admitted after a long pause. His voice was low, almost breaking. 10 years ago. She nodded slowly, her hand brushing the stem of her glass but not lifting it. "I lost someone too," she whispered. The air between them shifted. It was no longer a blind date in a glittering restaurant. It was two people standing on the fragile bridge between past and future. Nathaniel felt his pulse quicken, a sense of recognition settling deep in his bones. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else, something larger. As the next firework lit up the night sky, Eleanor held his gaze and added softly, "Maybe that's why we're here." Nathaniel felt a chill run through him, not from fear, but from the sense that destiny had just taken its seat at their table. The countdown to midnight pulsed through the restaurant like a heartbeat. Laughter grew louder, glasses clinked, couples leaned closer as if bracing for the strike of 12. Nathaniel felt the tension coil in his chest as he sat across from Eleanor, every word they exchanged carrying more weight than the one before. He could sense the unspoken histories between them, like two locked rooms they had only just admitted existed. Their plates were cleared, but neither had touched dessert. The waiter had offered champagne for the terrace celebration, and Nathaniel had agreed without thinking. Now, as the crowd shifted toward the glass doors leading outside, he hesitated. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him again with that unsettling accuracy. "You want to leave?" she said softly, not as a question but as a truth. "I should," Nathaniel admitted, voice low, "but I don't want to." Something flickered in her expression, relief mixed with a quiet daring. She rose first, her emerald dress catching the light, and extended a hand. He took it before doubt could speak. The terrace was cold, winter air brushing their skin, but heat lamps glowed above small clusters of guests. Beyond them, the Charles River gleamed black and endless. Eleanor led him toward a quieter corner, away from the crowd, her grip steady on his hand as though she knew he might run. "I almost canceled tonight," she confessed suddenly, her breath clouding in the frosted air. "Why didn't you?" Nathaniel asked, though part of him feared the answer. "Because Daniel believed in this," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "And because when he talked about you, there was something in his face I couldn't ignore, as if he knew we'd recognize each other in a way most people never do." Nathaniel's heart stuttered. Recognition. That was exactly what it felt like. Not the polite discovery of strangers, but the unsettling familiarity of two souls brushing against each other after years apart. The crowd began to chant. 60 seconds to midnight. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping lower. "He told me about your sister," she said carefully, "and I need you to know something. I lost someone too. My husband. 8 years ago." Her words fell like stones into the silence between them. Nathaniel's breath caught, his mind racing to process the revelation. For a decade he had lived convinced that no one could truly understand the hollow echo of absence he carried. Yet here she stood, steady and unflinching, carrying her own loss like a lantern in the dark. 30 seconds. The crowd shouted louder, but their corner felt hushed, suspended outside of time. "Is that why you've hidden yourself?" Eleanor asked gently. "Because it's easier than risking pain again." Nathaniel nodded before he could stop himself. "And you," he countered, voice barely audible. "Is that why you threw yourself into work? To stay ahead of the emptiness?" She smiled faintly, eyes shimmering in the glow of the heat lamp. "Maybe we've both been running in opposite directions, and maybe tonight was meant to stop us." 10 seconds. The air thickened, every second stretching like an eternity. Eleanor's free hand found his arm, light but sure. Nathaniel felt every defense he had spent years constructing begin to collapse. He searched her eyes, saw no pity, only recognition and daring hope. 5, 4, 3. Nathaniel leaned in, his heart hammering. 2, 1. The sky erupted in color, golden light flashing across Eleanor's face as their lips met. The kiss was not the hesitant touch of strangers, but the startling collision of two lives that had carried too much silence. It was fierce and tender, a promise and a risk all at once. When they finally drew apart, the cheers of the crowd echoed around them, but Nathaniel heard only her whisper against his lips. "Happy New Year." And for the first time in a decade, he whispered it back and meant it. The days that followed should have felt ordinary again, but nothing about Nathaniel's life felt ordinary anymore. He woke each morning with the taste of Eleanor's kiss still lingering like a secret only the two of them shared. Work seemed duller, the endless spreadsheets even more hollow. For the first time in years, he found himself watching the clock, waiting for the hours to pass, waiting for something beyond routine. It was Eleanor who reached out first. Her message arrived mid-morning, simple but pulsing with promise. "Lunch today. I know a place in Cambridge, Ethiopian food. You'll like it." Nathaniel read it twice, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Before he could convince himself otherwise, his fingers tapped out a reply. "I'd love to. Send me the address." The restaurant was small and unpretentious, its walls painted in warm colors, the air fragrant with spices that clung to the skin. Nathaniel spotted her at a corner table, dressed in dark jeans and a soft white sweater that seemed to glow against her skin. When she looked up and smiled, the noise of the lunch crowd faded, leaving only the rush of blood in his ears. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted as he sat down. "I almost didn't," Nathaniel confessed. "Then I remembered what you said about running. I've done enough of that." She laughed softly, breaking off a piece of spongy injera bread. There was no awkwardness this time, no careful dance of strangers. Their hands brushed as she showed him how to scoop lentils and vegetables, the touch sending a current up his arm. Conversation flowed as easily as the food was shared. They spoke of books, of music, of the little things that shaped their days. Yet beneath the comfort lay something else, an unspoken tension, as though both knew the ground they walked on was fragile. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor grew quieter. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her napkin, her gaze fixed on the table before she finally lifted her eyes to his. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice steady but edged with weight. Nathaniel set down his bread, the knot in his stomach tightening. "Last night when I mentioned my grandmother's house in Virginia," she continued, "I couldn't shake a memory. The house is on Maple Street. 10 years ago there was a car accident right in front of it. My grandmother was the first person on the scene." Nathaniel froze, his blood running cold. His mind reached for denial, for logic, but every word she spoke pulled him deeper into a truth he had never expected to hear. "She told me about the young woman in the blue car," Eleanor went on. "She stayed with her until the ambulance came. She prayed with her. She wrapped her in a quilt." Eleanor's voice faltered, her eyes fixed on him now, searching, almost afraid.
Nathaniel, what was your sister's name again?
The room tilted. Noise from other tables blurred into nothing. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, his throat so tight he could barely speak. Amelia, he whispered. The name hung between them like a ghost. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand warm against his trembling fingers.
My grandmother still talks about that night, she said softly. About the girl in the blue Honda Civic. About how she held her hand. How she promised she wouldn't let her be alone.
Nathaniel's chest ached with a force that nearly broke him. For years he had pictured Amelia frightened and abandoned, her last moments a mystery locked away. Now, across the table, Eleanor was giving him something he never imagined possible. Answers.
She said the girl's last words were to thank Clara,
Eleanor whispered.
My grandmother's name is Clara Hayes.
Nathaniel's vision blurred. His sister's final words, the ones he had never understood in the paramedics' report, now struck him like a thunderclap. Amelia had not been calling out for a cousin in Seattle. She had been thanking the stranger who held her in the dark. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. For 10 years I've wondered if she was alone.
She wasn't,
Eleanor said firmly.
My grandmother was with her every moment, and she's never stopped praying for your family since.
The restaurant swirled with noise and color, but Nathaniel and Eleanor sat in a stillness that was both unbearable and sacred. It felt like fate had torn open a door neither of them had known was waiting. And now, through that door, Nathaniel saw the possibility of healing, and a truth that would change everything. Nathaniel barely slept that night. The image of Amelia in those final moments would not leave him, but for the first time the picture had shifted. Instead of a faceless loneliness, he imagined a quilt wrapped around her, the warm hands of a stranger offering comfort. Clara Hayes. A name that had lived in the shadows of his grief now carried the weight of salvation. By morning, exhaustion clung to him, but there was a strange clarity too. He knew what had to come next, even if it terrified him. Eleanor called just after sunrise, her voice calm but carrying an edge of vulnerability. She asked if he had thought about what she revealed. He laughed bitterly, not at her, but at the absurdity of fate. I've thought about nothing else, he admitted. I found the quilt this morning, Eleanor. It's been in my closet for 10 years, yellow with purple flowers. Exactly as you said. Silence hung between them. Then she whispered, She'll want to see you. My grandmother. She remembers everything about that night. The idea of meeting Clara felt unbearable, yet irresistible. Fear of reopening wounds tangled with the desperate need for closure. Nathaniel agreed, his voice cracking with the weight of it. 2 days later, he stood outside Eleanor's apartment, the quilt folded in a canvas bag. She opened the door, the aroma of Caribbean spices filling the air, and her eyes softened when she saw what he carried. She touched the edge of the fabric gently, as though it might shatter. We'll give it to her together, she said. Dinner was simple but perfect, and afterward they sat on her couch, the quilt between them like a silent witness. Nathaniel spoke of Amelia for hours, stories he had locked away, while Eleanor listened with the patience of someone who understood loss. Each word lightened him and tethered him to her at once. The evening ended with a kiss far gentler than the one on New Year's Eve, a kiss that tasted of trust rather than fire. When they finally boarded the flight to Virginia, Nathaniel felt his pulse hammering against his ribs. Eleanor reached across the armrest and threaded her fingers through his. She might cry when she sees you, she warned softly. She might tell you things that will hurt, but she'll also tell you the truth. The drive from the airport was quiet, the January sky pressing low with the threat of snow. Nathaniel tried to picture the house, tried to imagine stepping into the very place where Amelia's life had slipped away. His stomach knotted tighter with every mile. Then they turned onto Maple Street. The houses stood like sentinels, each with its own history. Eleanor slowed the car and pointed. That one. Nathaniel's breath caught. The yellow Victorian with white trim stood proud against the gray sky, its porch draped in winter ivy. On the steps stood an elderly woman wrapped in a deep purple headscarf, her posture regal despite her years. She had been waiting for them. Clara Hayes descended the steps with surprising grace. Her arms opened wide. Day as. Eleanor rushed to embrace her, their laughter mingling with the cold air. Then Clara turned to Nathaniel, her eyes dark and knowing, her voice strong despite its tremor. "Nathaniel Carter," she said. "I've been praying for this day for 10 years. Before he could speak, she wrapped him in an embrace fiercer than any he had known since Amelia was alive. He stiffened, then melted into it, overwhelmed by the scent of vanilla and herbs. The quilt weighed heavy in his bag, but Clara's words carried something heavier still. "Come inside," she told him. "It's time you heard what your sister wanted you to know." Nathaniel followed her up the porch steps, every nerve alight, aware that once he crossed the threshold, his life would never again be the same. Snow began to fall as Nathaniel stepped into Clara Hayes's living room, the air scented with cinnamon and old wood. Family photographs lined the mantel, generations captured in sepia and color, their faces radiating the kind of legacy he had always lacked. The yellow quilt rested across his lap like a bridge between two worlds. Clara sat opposite him, her hands folded neatly, her eyes sharper than any courtroom judge. "I remember everything about that night," she said, her voice low but steady. "It was cold, just like today. I was reading my Bible when I heard the crash. At first, I thought it was thunder, but then I knew. I ran outside without a coat, and there she was, your sister. She was still conscious when I reached her." Nathaniel's breath hitched. For years he had lived with a question that hollowed him out. Was Amelia afraid? Was she alone? He leaned forward, desperate for answers. "She wasn't alone," Clara said firmly, reading the pain in his eyes. "She introduced herself to me. She smiled even though she was hurting. She said her brother would blame himself, and she made me promise to tell you it wasn't your fault." The words broke something inside him. Tears blurred his vision as Clara's voice wove around him like the quilt itself. "She asked me to tell you she loved you, Nat. Haniel, that you had to keep living, really living, not just existing in the shadow of her loss." Nathaniel bent forward, his hands covering his face, a raw sob tearing from his chest. Eleanor's hand pressed against his back, grounding him as Clara leaned across and held his trembling fingers. "She laughed once before she went," Clara continued, her tone softer now. "I told her I was just a nosy old woman who couldn't mind her own business. She called me an angel. She wasn't afraid at the end, Nathaniel. She was smiling." The room spun. He had carried 10 years of guilt, convinced his sister had died terrified, abandoned. Now the truth shattered that prison. She had not been alone. She had not been afraid. And she had thought of him until her final breath. "I tried to fight the paramedics when they pulled me back," Clara whispered, her eyes shining. "I didn't want her to feel deserted. But she was already gone, wrapped in love and prayer." Nathaniel's sobs quieted, replaced by a hollow silence that trembled with release. Eleanor leaned closer, whispering words he could not yet process, her hand never leaving his arm. When he finally lifted his head, Clara's gaze met his with unwavering strength. "I prayed every day you would come, that you would hear what she wanted you to know. You've been punishing yourself for a decade, but she asked me to tell you to stop, to live, to love." The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, marking the moment as if sealing it in time. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the street where Amelia's car had once crumpled against an oak. Nathaniel looked toward the window, his reflection layered against falling white. "I don't know how to live without guilt," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Then let us show you," Eleanor said softly, her hand now entwined with his. Clara nodded, her silver head wrap catching the light like a crown. "You came to my door with that quilt," Clara said, her voice rich with conviction. "And I tell you now, child, you left with something greater. A chance to start again. A chance to honor Amelia not by mourning, but by living the life she wanted for you. Nathaniel felt the truth press into his bones. For the first time in 10 years, the weight he carried shifted, just enough to let in a breath of something he had nearly forgotten: hope. The snow outside Clara's house turned the garden into a world of white silence, but inside the old Victorian, the air pulsed with something heavier than weather. Nathaniel sat with Eleanor on the floral sofa, the quilt draped across both their laps, its weight no longer just fabric but history. Clara's words about Amelia echoed in his head, stirring emotions he had locked away for a decade. He had come here expecting pain. Instead, he found his chest breaking open with a mixture of grief and something dangerously close to hope. After tea and the telling of Amelia's last moments, Clara excused herself to the kitchen, giving them space. Nathaniel turned toward Eleanor, unable to stop staring at her. Snowflakes clung to her curls from when they had stepped out briefly on the porch, and her eyes shimmered with the same mixture of strength and fragility that had pulled him toward her from the start. "You didn't have to bring me here," he said, his voice unsteady. "You could have kept that story to yourself. Most people would have." Eleanor shook her head. "Most people aren't raised by Clara Hayes. She believes truth heals more than silence ever could. I think she's right. Look at you. For the first time since I met you, you're not hiding." Nathaniel swallowed hard. The walls he had built felt thinner than paper now. He wanted to speak, to release the words pressing against his ribs, but fear still fought to hold him silent. Eleanor reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, and suddenly he knew what he had to say. "I'm falling in love with you," he admitted, his voix ice rough but clear. "I know it's fast, and maybe it's reckless, but after 10 years of nothing, I can't lie to myself anymore. I feel alive when I'm with you, Eleanor. Alive in a way I thought I'd forgotten how to be." Her breath caught, her lips parting in shock, but the tremor in her eyes wasn't fear. It was recognition. She lifted his hand to her cheek, pressing it there. "I feel it too," she whispered. "And it terrifies me, because the last time I gave my heart to someone, he was gone before I could imagine life without him. But you make me believe I can risk it again." The room seemed to contract around them, the ticking of the grandfather clock louder, the snow falling harder beyond the window. Nathaniel leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was not just tenderness, but surrender, both of them giving in to what fate had set in motion. When they pulled apart, Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We don't know what comes next," she warned. "This isn't a fairy tale. We both carry scars." "Maybe scars don't mean the story is over," Nathaniel said softly. "Maybe they mean the story's still being written." Clara's voice drifted from the kitchen, calling them to supper, and the spell of the moment bent but did not break. Eleanor rose first, smoothing her sweater, but Nathaniel caught her wrist gently. "After dinner," he said, "take me to the garden. I want to see where you sit, where she's remembered." Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then be ready, Nathaniel, because once you see it, you won't walk away unchanged." Suspense curled in his chest as he followed her into the dining room. He didn't know what awaited him in that garden under the snow, but something told him it would change the course of his life more than any boardroom deal or penthouse contract ever had. And for the first time in years, he wanted change. He wanted to step into it, even if it burned. The night deepened in Winchester, and after dinner, Clara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and guided Nathaniel and Eleanor out into the garden. Snow crunched under their shoes, the path lit by a single lantern Clara carried like a torch through the dark. The bench sat beneath a bare oak, its iron arms frosted white, a small plaque gleaming faintly in the glow. Nathaniel's chest tightened as he brushed snow away and read the words, "In memory of all those who found peace in this garden." Clara's voice broke the silence. This place became more than a garden after Amelia's accident. People came here. Strangers, neighbors, friends. Each left something behind. Grief, love, hope. It became a sanctuary. Nathaniel sank onto the bench, Eleanor beside him, the quilt spread across both their laps. The air was sharp and cold, but inside he felt something warmer stirring, a
a quiet force pushing back against years of emptiness. He traced the engraved letters with his gloved hand, his throat tight. "I've been carrying her death like a punishment," he confessed, his voice breaking. "But sitting here, it feels like maybe it wasn't the end of everything. Maybe it was the beginning of something I couldn't see." Eleanor leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Beginnings are often disguised as endings," she murmured. Snowflakes spiraled around them, landing in her curls, catching in the folds of the quilt. Nathaniel turned his head to look at her, his breath trembling. "What happens when we go back to Boston?" he asked. "When the world isn't softened by snow and Clara's wisdom, when it's just us and the noise and the routines that swallowed me before." Eleanor lifted her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Then we fight for what we've started. We don't let fear become routine again." Clara, listening quietly a few feet away, nodded in approval. "Love that survives grief is stronger than most people will ever know, but it will demand courage every day." For the first time, Nathaniel didn't shrink from the word love. He let it settle inside him, heavy and real. The sound of it in Eleanor's presence no longer felt impossible. He drew in a slow breath, his decision forming as solidly as the snow beneath his boots. "I'm leaving consulting," he said suddenly, startling even himself. "I've been thinking about it since the night we met. I can't spend the rest of my life staring at spreadsheets when there's a story I need to write. Amelia's story. Ours. This quilt's. I want to finish the novel I abandoned 10 years ago." Eleanor's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock, then slowly curving into something softer. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure," Nathaniel answered. "For years I chose safety over living. Amelia's last words weren't about guilt. They were a plea for me to live. I have to honor that." A gust of wind swept through the garden, scattering snowflakes like confetti. Eleanor reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "Then we'll do it together," she said. "Your words, my work, our lives. We'll build something that lasts." Clara placed her lantern on the bench, its light glowing warmly against the metal. "The two of you are standing on holy ground," she said softly. "Don't waste it." Nathaniel looked from Clara to Eleanor, and then to the quilt draped across them. For 10 years it had been a relic of death. Tonight, it became a symbol of rebirth. And as the snow fell heavier, blanketing the garden in white, he knew his life had crossed a threshold. There was no going back to loneliness. There was only forward, into the unknown, into the terrifying, beautiful risk of love. Spring arrived in Boston with blossoms that seemed to paint the city in second chances. Cherry trees flared pink along Commonwealth Avenue. The river glimmered in morning light, and Nathaniel sat at his desk in the Marlborough Street apartment he now shared with Eleanor. The yellow quilt hung on the wall above their bed, a sentinel of memory and promise, watching over this new chapter they were building. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, then began to move. Words poured out, not numbers, not calculations, but sentences that felt alive. The novel he had abandoned years ago was breathing again. The front door opened and Eleanor's voice carried down the hallway, warm and bright. She stepped inside his office, her curls caught with sunlight, a stack of papers tucked under her arm. "The pro bono division launched today," she announced, her smile both proud and tired. "We already have 3 families asking for help. It feels right, Nathaniel. Hard, but right." He pushed back his chair and crossed the room, pulling her into his arms. "So does this," he murmured, gesturing to the glowing manuscript on his laptop. "I finally finished the first draft." Her eyes widened, tears rising quickly. "Amelia would be proud," she whispered. He kissed her softly, the taste of hope lingering between them. Their life together was not without tension, money tighter than it had ever been, long hours tugging them in different directions. But beneath it ran a current of strength, a bond born from grief and forged into something unbreakable. That weekend they drove to the airport with Daniel in the back seat, teasing Nathaniel endlessly about how he deserved credit for the entire story. Clara's flight from Virginia was already landing when they arrived, and when she appeared through the glass doors, regal in her purple dress and silver head wrap, Nathaniel felt a rush of gratitude so sharp it brought him to his knees inside. She embraced them both as if they had been her children all along. Instead of taking her straight to the senior apartment they had prepared for her, Clara asked for one detour. She led them through the gate into their new garden, smaller than her Winchester sanctuary, but already alive, with roses and herbs. She held an envelope in her hand, which she pressed into Nathaniel's palm. Inside was a letter from the Winchester Historical Society. The Yellow Victorians Garden had been officially renamed the Amelia and Julian Memorial Garden, a place where future generations would sit, grieve, love, and heal. Eleanor's eyes brimmed as she clutched Nathaniel's hand. "She'll never be forgotten," she said. "Not as long as you live like she asked you to," Clara replied firmly. Then her eyes twinkled with something sharper. "And not as long as you raise the child she's surely smiling about already." Eleanor's gasp gave her away. Nathaniel turned to her, stunned, then saw the truth in her trembling smile. "We were going to wait to tell you," she admitted softly. The world tilted. For a moment, Nathaniel could not breathe. Then joy erupted through him like fireworks across a midnight sky. He sank to his knees before Eleanor, his hand resting gently against her stomach. "A new life," he whispered, his voice breaking. "A new story." Clara placed her hands over theirs, her own eyes wet. "This is what love looks like when it comes full circle." The three of them sat on the garden bench as the spring sun filtered through the blossoms, their hands layered together, the yellow quilt catching the light from the bedroom window above. Nathaniel closed his eyes, hearing Amelia's voice as if she stood beside him. "Tell him I love him. Tell him to keep living, really living." He opened his eyes to Eleanor's smile, to Clara's wisdom, to the child they would soon welcome. For the first time in a decade, he was not haunted by silence. He was surrounded by life, and he knew, with unshakable certainty, that this was only the beginning.